Talk more about this very complex case. With me now, CNN's legal analyst Philip Holloway, a criminal defense attorney, and CNN law enforcement analyst Cedric Alexander, who heads up public safety in DeKalb County, Georgia, just outside of Atlanta. Good to see both of you gentlemen.
Great to see you.
All right, so Cedric, I wonder if you could address this first. When you look at the videotape, of course, the first question that comes to most people's minds was that the only option that that police officer had? The officer says he tried to run me over. What do you see as you look at that video?
Well, certainly upon first blush looking at this, it certainly does create some pause as to whether he should have used deadly force or not. But here's what I always have to keep in mind. I'm only looking at one segment of this entire scenario, right? And if we look at that, yes, we can say, you know, something here doesn't look right on the part of the officer. But the bigger question is, quite frankly, is what was the solicitor thinking as she was going through this investigation that was provided to her by SLED? How did she come to the conclusion that this should not go any further than her desk?
So what, what are some of the things that are being evaluated? Because when, you know, an officer says, I thought he was going to run me over, you look at the videotape and yes, the car was speeding off. Right. Maybe we don't know in terms of inches or feet.
That's right.
You know, what kind of contact there might have been.
Here again, he's in that position. I'm not standing where he is. He's in that position at that particular moment in time. And the angle in which he could have felt that his life was in danger, he needed to be able to articulate that to a point.
So is de-escalation ever an element that an officer has to take into consideration when there's a moment like that? What are the options of de-escalation?
Yes, it is. And certainly another officer may approach this car very, very differently. This particular lieutenant approached it the way he did. So it's going to be varying ways in which you can do that. And we have to understand, police is not an exact science. It really is not. You are put in positions sometimes where you have to make decisions that are life-threatening. And as you heard the sheriff say, when you sign up for this. But at the same time, you have a responsibility still to protect the best interests of the public. And in this case, from what we see in this video, did he appear to be threatened by this vehicle running over him? And from what I see on this video, it creates further question for me from the angle in which I'm looking at it. But here's the thing, Frederica.
What does that mean?
What that means very
you do not want to say.
No, it's not, because in all fairness, how can I say very specifically, when I look at that video at first blush, absolutely it creates some pause on the part of the officer. But you got to remember, I'm not looking at an entire investigation. And you understand what I'm saying? I'm not looking at the lieutenant's statement. So there's a lot of other things that have to be taken into consideration. So I'm not going to sit here and say but we have a process in this country. But maybe the bigger question is also, should this have gone to a grand jury? That's the bigger question. That's part of the whole criminal justice reform that you hear us talking about that maybe need to be reviewed so that there is more accountability on parts of police officers and that of the public as well.
So then, Philip, the prosecutor saying no reason to charge, meaning there will be no grand jury involved here, but the federal authorities are investigating. How will they look at that videotape? Because we talk about, you know, that really is the moment that we're dissecting right now. But from a federal, you know, I guess investigative standpoint, how critical would that moment be?
The U.S. Supreme Court tells us that all law enforcement use of force incidents must be reviewed from a perspective of objective reasonableness, not just did he in fact believe his life was in danger, because I think it's obvious from the video, as a matter of fact, Monday morning quarterbacking it probably was not. That's not the end of the inquiry. You have to decide whether or not it would be objectively reasonable for him to feel that way. In other words, would a reasonable officer in like or similar circumstances feel the same way? Now, I can tell you that
a vehicle moving away from the officer holding a gun.
Right. In other words, would a reasonable officer have put themselves in that position, and would a reasonable officer have felt it necessary to fire their weapon at that point in time?
How do you know the answer to that? How do you get to the answer to that? A reasonable officer?
That's the $64,000 question. But see, the problem that I have, one of the problems that I have with this case, and I agree with Cedric 100%, it should have gone to a grand jury. The prosecutor, within 2 weeks of the shooting, made a statement to a juvenile court in South Carolina that the details of Zachary's juvenile history prove his specific intent to run the officer over. So when she comes out this past week and says, after careful consideration of all the circumstances, I've reached this conclusion, it sort of flies in the face of what she has said publicly within just weeks of the shooting, Frederica.
And you spoke with the family member's attorney.
I did.
And what was said?
Well, a lot of the questions that they have and a lot of the complaints that they have are with the process and with the way that the solicitor unilaterally made this decision. And when I talk about objective reasonableness, I'm not talking about what you might think in your particular mind. It's what a objective person or someone in like or similar circumstances would think. So what she has done is she has unilaterally made a decision that this was objectively reasonable. And she has left out the entire question of whether or not a reasonable officer under the same circumstances would have done the same thing. This should have gone to a grand jury because I can tell you opinions are all over the place on this one.
And Cedric, is that problematic to you that the prosecutor would make that kind of judgment before seeing
well, we live in a very different time of policing in America, correct? And we're looking at this whole Ferguson effect that we hear about a lot. There is no Ferguson effect. What it is, Ferguson was a tipping point for the American people across this country, all Americans, to say there needs to be criminal justice reform. Part of that reform, of course, is more police accountability, but part of that reform also questions DAs across this country as well, too, as do you need to do that investigation and make that decision, or should it go to a grand jury? It's part of the bigger issue that is going on in this country today. And we're talking about it more today because of where we are in policing across this country. This is not about a Ferguson effect. This is about America saying to all of us, we want to see something different in criminal justice across this country. That's what this is all really about. And this is a good example. This could be a very good example of what we just watched, of an opportunity where that could have been shifted, possibly. And I'm not criticizing this DA. That was their decision by law. But under these types of circumstances, in this climate that we live in, should this have gone to a grand jury?
Or at least to an independent outside prosecutor who doesn't work so closely with the police in that jurisdiction. That's also a big issue, and it will give us a lot more confidence in the results of the investigation. I think publicly, whether it's real or perceived, there might be a conflict of interest.
Same kind of argument that was made in Ferguson, since you bring up the whole Ferguson effect, but that argument was made with the prosecutor McCullough there too. All right, Cedric Alexander, Philip Holloway, good to see both of you.
Thanks, Fred.
Thank you. All right, right now I want to...